Good evening and welcome to this presentation of the latest Jimmy Reid Foundation paper entitled Devolving Employment Legislation. My name's Dave Watson and I'm the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation and the author of this paper. By way of introduction, we first of all set out in the paper the current state of employment in Scotland, which is summarised essentially as being good progress on the living wage, but we still got low pay, poor working conditions, and a lack of effective voice. This was all highlighted last year in our paper assessing of fair work in Scotland, which recognised the progress and the role of the Fair Work Initiative in achieving some improvements, but it also recognised that there were limits of voluntarism, and that was something highlighted by trade union reps in the interviews we did. The devolution of employment law is supported by the STUC and most trade unions in Scotland, and as of last year's Congress, the TUC on a UK basis as well. It has some fairly broad political support in Scotland with the SNP and the Greens, particularly obviously in the context of independence, but also Scottish Labour, although UK Labour has recently changed its position and is no longer supporting that, or at least its spokesperson isn't. But none of those who support devolution have really explained what it involves and how you go about it. So this paper seeks to bridge that gap. So let's start with the case for devolution. Those who argue for it argue it complements existing powers, particularly economic policy, education, training, and the well-being economy. They also point to a different approach to industrial relations in Scotland since devolution, from the Memorandum of Understanding to Fair Work, and generally better industrial relations, particularly in the public sector. Voluntary organisations like Poverty Alliance and others point to broad public support in their survey for devolution. And in Kalman and Smith Commission submissions, trade unions and others highlighted employment rights, equality, health and safety, and immigration as employment-related powers that they'd like to see devolved. And many of these powers, of course, are already devolved to Northern Ireland, so that demonstrates there's no inherent legal difficulty in devolving it. This is a matter of public policy and political will. Now, there are opponents to devolution. We recognise that in the paper and summarise their arguments. Generally, it's UK employer-based organisations who oppose. They argue for the simplicity of a UK system. That's a legitimate argument, but of course you could make the same argument for just about every devolved power, and I'm afraid that train left the station some 25 years ago. It's certainly the case that more could be done with existing powers, as we set out in last year's Fair Work paper, but we also recognise that enforcement, which was an important issue for union reps, can't be achieved with a voluntary approach. So getting to the meat of the paper, first of all, we set out the employment law framework. So what we do in each section is to explain what employment law is, what the various sections are, what would be involved in devolving them, and some commentary on the existing state of play. So the most obvious one, and the one everyone understands generally, is employment rights. There is the 96 Act, but there are others as well. It's a fairly complicated picture, and it's in need of some tidying up, which would be another job for devolution. But generally, these cover things like basic employment rights. What should be in a contract of employment, your right not to be unfairly dismissed, redundancy payments, and the like. We do a section on the Human Rights Act 1998. That human rights are incorporated into employment law, generally as part of that legislation, rather than a standalone right, with the exception, of course, of the public sector. Now, all of these will continue to apply when devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so there's really no need to devolve that legislation in itself. Trade union legislation, that includes the rights of trade unions, for example, not to be sued when lawful industrial action is undertaken, but also their responsibilities in terms of the rules around industrial action and their internal governance as well as certification. On wages, we're really talking here about the statutory minimum wage, that's called the national living wage and the national minimum wage, highlighting in the paper how limited the enforcement of that is and the important links to the economy and the link to the Scottish living wage. Equal opportunity discrimination is a bit more complicated because there are different provisions, not all of which are employment related. But clearly the employment-related ones are an essential part of employment law and should be devolved. We don't recommend in this paper devolving some of the more reserved issues such as consumer law, although I accept there is a case to be made for doing so. Health and safety has long been argued as being appropriate for devolution. Some aspects already are in terms of the enforcement powers of local authorities, and of course the health service is devolved as well. We currently suffer from weak enforcement of safety in Scotland, largely because of UK government budget cuts, and there are specific health and safety issues in Scotland that have been highlighted by Scottish Hazards and others. There are some broader, I call employment-related provisions in legislation that we need to address, and the paper does so. One of those is social security, avoiding. Generally, trade unions seek to avoid cyclical benefits being devolved because of the impact it has on the Scottish budget, and without full fiscal autonomy, which has its own problems, you really wouldn't want to be devolving things like the state pension and job seekers allowance. Occupational pensions is a bit more complicated. There is some regulatory devolution of public service pension schemes, but not, and that should be fully devolved. No real dispute around that. But for company occupational pension schemes, often very small scale matters in investment, and really it would be very complicated to split those up. Immigration, there's been a fairly long debate around this, and there's no doubt that Scotland needs a very different immigration requirements, largely due to our different demographic change to the rest of the UK. And the Scottish Government and others have argued for some limited partial devolution, probably based on the Canadian model. That shows the high retention is possible. With immigration, one of the main arguments against devolving it is that people would leave Scotland once they arrive here. And that just hasn't happened on the basis of international evidence. Company law has some employment-related aspects to it. There's bankruptcy and insolvency. Some aspects are already devolved, and the law around directors. But largely speaking, these things are incidental to the main body of company law. And there's an argument being made for that, but it's really out with the scope of this paper. One aspect which is not company law is employment rights, is the transfer of undertakings protection of employment legislation, which involves when workers are transferred between all companies and organisations, what's known as TUPE, and these are really employment rights and should be devolved. Finally, the health professions. Some are devolved already and some are reserved. It's really an anomaly, the reserved elements. Teachers and social workers are devolved, but doctors and nurses are not. When the health service and health generally is devolved, that frankly makes no sense at all. Now, if we devolve employment law, we'd have to have Scottish institutions, and these would require, and I've listed them here, we need a certification officer to regulate trade unions. We need ACAS for their industrial relations and employment tribunal functions. Same would apply to the very small, very limited Central Arbitration Committee and the Low Pay Commission, which advises on the minimum wage. The Health and Safety Executive would need a Scottish base, as would the functions of the UK Department of Business and Trade. These are largely around issues like redundancy payments, and that there is already a civil service department in Scotland dealing with fair work, and it would simply transfer to them. In terms of softer areas, we clearly need some increased capacity in the court system, need to discuss the role of legal aid, and certainly strengthen enforcement proceedings, which is the one area where actually the English system is better than the Scottish system and is in dire need of reform. We'd also need to look at the capacity of universities as backup to the legislation and the discussion around it. Law firms would have to up their game, as would advocates, and we need to strengthen law centres as well. In terms of legislation, it's really quite straightforward. There would be amendments to the Scotland Act to remove various reservations in Schedule 5 of the 1998 Act, and it could be done on as the Labour Party originally proposed, on an improvement-only basis. So you provide essentially a UK-wide base of which devolved governments could improve upon. Now, the paper is quite deliberately is not another grand wish list of what would happen what if employment law was devolved. Others have done some of that. This is really about the how and the why of the process. But nonetheless, there's little point in devolving if you're not going to use the powers for progressive purposes. Political parties have set out their ideas, SNP in their employment after independence paper, the Labour Party's New Deal. I point to the Institute of Employment Rights Manifesto for Labour Law as a good framework. That list there, those 6 points, clearly cover all the main things that we would like to see in a devolved Scotland. And also, I think there's an opportunity to develop new approaches to industrial relations and employment rights in Scotland. That's the beauty of devolution. Smaller countries like Scotland can do this much more quickly than can be done in England. And in particular, I point to the Scandinavian model, which recognises the place of trade unions within Scotland and acknowledges their role in the functioning of a decent society. So, in conclusion, it'd be fair to say that employment standards in Scotland could be better and need to be improved. The case for devolution is strong and has very broad support politically and across civic society. What this paper seeks to do is to set out the precise powers that need to be devolved and how you'd go about doing so. We also explain the new institutions that would need to be created to support that devolution. And overall, it would provide an opportunity to build a new approach to industrial relations and strengthen the well-being economy. You can read the full paper and download it from the Reid Foundation website. The address is there. And if you've got any queries or questions, please feel free to email us. Thank you for listening.